Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Chapter 53. Columns.
Aren't we going to stay up here for another few days? Zach said the pups need more time.
Aiden was surprised to find himself outside on a beautiful day, convincing his siblings that continuing to investigate was a good idea.
Aiden, this place is a total disaster.
Newa complained.
Of the two buildings we've been in so far, the ceiling has collapsed on both of them. I'm seeing a pattern.
But this building is in better shape.
He gestured to the stone building they'd guessed was a temple. Saying this rationale out loud felt slightly embarrassing.
Our first night here, we slept under floorboards because that was all that remained of the roadhouse.
Newa said.
A far cry from sleeping in a warm bed the night before, but at least we were all together. Also, we had nowhere else to go. This time we know where we need to go. And if we stay, another ceiling is going to come crashing down on us.
Clyde, listening to the family discussion, felt put off at the second mention of a ceiling collapsing. She wasn't sure if her sister was indirectly rebuking her, but she didn't care to hear about it again. The tikus headed back inside to be with Mitra.
We do have a destination now,
Rakaru said.
But I think we should stay until the litter is a little bigger. It's hard for me to imagine the babies will be much hardier in just 2 days, but we'll see what Mitra says about it. Our current shelter survived the elements this long. Hopefully it can withstand 2 more days.
Does that mean you'll go with me, Rook?
Aiden asked.
If this building really was, a temple, then it was built to honor a god, right? Professor Gorram hated talking about gods, but I'd like to know more.
Rakaru was not surprised his brother wanted to explore the temple. Gorram had never mentioned a possible connection between Aiden's healing ability and drawing power from gods, but he'd repudiated both for similar reasons.
And Clyde, you like exploring new...
Aiden realized his sister was no longer with them. He sighed.
I was about to say there might be artifacts inside.
If that building really does belong to a god,
Rakaru said,
then perhaps pilfering valuables from inside is a bad idea. We don't know what the gods are capable of doing. If they have arcana or other abilities, I'm sure their powers are greater than ours.
Do you mean valuables as in money?
Newa asked, giggling.
I think we've been doing just fine without money so far. Aiden, you were even able to buy a whole person with hazelnuts.
Aiden huffed and began walking towards the temple building by himself. Rakaru had started giggling too. Aiden didn't appreciate the humor in his idea.
Wait a minute,
Rakaru said, jogging to catch up.
I'll go with you. I wanted to ask you something earlier, but it felt like an awkward question. In case that structure isn't sound, and part of the building falls on us, do you feel your ability to heal has returned to you?
Yes.
Despite another fitful night's sleep, Aiden could feel that energy inside him once again. Newa heard her brothers talking and felt excluded from the discussion, but she also was glad Aiden hadn't obliged her to go with them. She only wanted to go if the 4 of them went in together. The gnome headed for the dormitory building to find Clyde.
Newa, where are you going?
Aiden called. He'd imagined she and Clyde would follow along if he just led the exploration.
I'll come help if you get pinned under loose columns.
Newa replied, heading inside. She was surprised to find only Mitra sitting with her sleeping litter, Shelfie beside her. She'd assumed Clyde had gone back to see them. She realized how loud her voice was. She started again, quietly.
Is Clyde here with you? I didn't mean to interrupt.
She was.
Mitra said, almost hesitating.
She was going to ask your brother for some water.
The tikus woman nodded to a bag beside her.
Oh, that's a thoughtful thing to do. I'm glad.
Newa recognized the bag as part of Azaka's personal effects. It contained more seeds that could magically grow when hydrated.
Thank you, Mitra. My brothers want to check out that last building, but we'll be back soon.
Newa had decided to join the search after all.
Be safe,
Mitra replied softly. She had no intention of mentioning that after Clyde had fetched Azaka's bag for her, the younger tikus had offered to bury the 2 stillborn pups in a hole she'd dug earlier behind the building. A proper burial was important to the mother, but she intended to do that later, privately. The four siblings stood before the stone building, which had a pair of stark columns framing its large wooden door. This door was shuttered tightly and possibly barricaded from the inside. Aiden tried pushing and pulling with all his might. Rikaru held out an arm and calmly asked him to stop. He then tried rushing the door open with his uninjured shoulder, realizing he was being impulsive.
Must be too many dead bodies against this one,
Niwa said.
Wow.
Aiden was both surprised and impressed by his sister's morbid joke.
I literally have the right tool for the job.
Niwa held out her doha, which had a crowbar at one end. She was excited to be helpful as she went to a boarded-up window, the base of which was at her eye level. Niwa frowned after failing to gain leverage. She was awkwardly prying open boards that were over her head.
I'll do it,
Aiden said.
Aiden, wait.
Rikaru said sternly.
Niwa, that's a great idea. Would you mind if Aiden uses that?
It's just as well.
Their sister handed over the crowbar.
These columns could give out at any time, and I wouldn't want to be standing under this little porch roof thing.
That's true.
Aiden said.
When it falls on me first, I'll try to leave room so you can crawl out from under my crushed body.
Honestly.
Rikaru still gave the soffit overhead a quick, appraising glance for his own reassurance. Aiden successfully removed the boards and looked in. The large room appeared unusually dark.
Thanks.
Aiden returned the doha to his sister. He then offered her a hand, which she refused.
Is there anyone in there?
Rikaru asked, hoping his siblings would cease their antics.
Nope.
Aiden said.
It looks like one big empty room. It smells musty like the last place, but kept up better.
Once her brother confirmed the coast was clear, Clyde gracefully leapt through the opening while Aiden was still lifting himself in. It was a subtle but effective way of humbling her brother in his zeal to explore first. As Rikaru was offering to help Niwa into the building, he heard Aiden mutter. Then Aiden grunted, then muttered again. He recognized the arcane words. Once inside, the siblings looked at Aiden with surprise.
What?
Aiden asked with a mischievous smile. He'd failed once, but then successfully cast Create Flame in his open hand.
Professor Gorram did teach us all Arcana. I was bound to pick up something.
By Aiden's illumination, they marveled at the strangeness this cloistered building on a hill contained. Chapter 54, Writing on the Wall.
Look at this lattice work.
Rikaru was fixated on the intricate masonry detail of the arched walls. Though crumbling, most of the crescent and clover patterns remained intact.
This reminds me of Raven's Tack. I've never seen such antique craftsmanship anywhere else.
I thought this was a temple.
Aiden held his sputtering fireball in a raised arm, watching its light retreat into the small nooks hollowed out from the walls.
Are you saying Laird's shop is also a temple?
We don't really know what either building used to be.
Rikaru said, still marveling at everything he saw.
Both are very old. Raven's Cross had a different aesthetic. Lots of colored glass and natural light. You could see through the lattice work in the shop. This detail work is carved right into the wall with only the 2 windows by the front door.
I don't mean to ruin the mood, but...
Niwa spoke a few arcane words, and light returned to her doha once again. Its illumination was superior to her brother's.
There, that's better. Maybe we can just unboard the windows and door. I can't imagine it's supposed to be this dark in here.
The siblings wandered through the spacious room, continuing to notice details all over the walls. The structure had the one main chamber with an arched ceiling and a large stone counter near the back. The floor was heavily tamped earth, still smooth and serviceable.
Look at these engravings.
Rikaru exclaimed, then also prepared a light spell. He discovered some writing, and the prospect of finding new knowledge filled him with joy.
I've never seen anything like this.
The little fire in Aiden's hand flickered as though it might extinguish.
Rook, we're all looking at the stuff on the walls.
He said irritably.
I meant I can't read this.
Rikaru said.
It sort of looks like pictographs. I mean, symbols. And sort of like a bas-relief. You're right, Aiden. There's a lot of it. This section seems to be talking about a battle, I think.
Hearing this, Aiden became interested and came over.
This wall is talking about life existing in another... Where are you seeing something about a battle?
Another what?
Niwa asked eagerly. She'd started to study an adjacent section without understanding much. Her brother's eyes widened.
Another plane?
He sounded unsure and breathless.
What's a plane?
Aiden, you can read this?
Rikaru asked.
This is unlike any written language I've ever seen, and that includes all the exotic documents in Saba's notes.
His brother hesitated.
I can only understand bits and pieces. They were delivered to the world to repair the life that had been lost. What's a plane, Rook?
That's what is written on the wall?
Rikaru realized his misunderstanding.
Oh, let me think. A plane can be an object gliding in air, or a flat surface, or a different level of existence.
Delivered to the world as in travel to the world?
Niwa asked. This was exciting and she wanted to participate too.
There's a plane of angels.
Aiden exclaimed. He remembered Saba mentioning angels to him once, equating them to creatures out of folklore.
I still can't believe you're reading this.
Rikaru said, holding the light up. He felt jealous and wished to learn more about this writing.
And you're saying world and plane as two distinct things.
What?
Aiden was only half listening.
This says angels came from some plane because something had killed most of the life in this world. I think there was a war, maybe between two angels or two gods.
This room could show us how to travel back to our world.
Niwa said.
We could go home.
That's an amazing idea.
Rikaru knew how much she wanted to go back.
Aubrey mentioned war.
Clyde had walked over to a large floor installation behind the counter.
She did?
Aiden perked up.
She said she didn't want us to bring war to her home. I thought it was only an expression.
Clyde explained. Although the light left her mostly in shadows, she used it to compare the stone inlaid in the hilt of her new dagger to the giant stone protruding from the packed dirt floor. They appeared to be the same material, but this one was large enough for her to stand on. Its shiny, black surface had several jagged edges and small spires.
Do you think she knows about this historic war?
Rikaru asked.
Nothing here, I don't think. Time to check another wall.
Aiden enjoyed his absurd-sounding comment. Clyde's siblings were all going to the opposite wall. As their light sources moved across the great room, their illumination passed over the black stone. In one fleeting glance, Clyde saw a terrifying image staring back at her. It was the gnome woman. Her translucent, colorless face looked solemn, but she was angrily clenching her teeth to hide her disdain. After the flash of reflected light passed by, the image was gone. Clyde quickly rejoined her siblings.
What is obsidian?
Aiden asked.
Obsidian?
Rikaru parroted the question.
Oh, I've heard of that. It's a material that comes from intense heat underground, I think. After it's exposed to the outside air temperature, it cools down and hardens into a shiny black substance. It looks like stone, but I believe it's technically glass.
Sure, why not?
Aiden felt confused and frustrated. He squinted at the writing, trying to make sense of it. Clyde felt bewildered at this sudden talk of obsidian after she'd just encountered it in her dagger and in the ground.
What about obsidian?
Niwa asked.
This wall says obsidian is special, and it represents everlasting hardness. Only vengeance can satisfy a grudge. I have no idea what that means.
That's odd.
Rikaru said.
I mean, I'm confused by that too. If I remember correctly, obsidian isn't really that hard of a material. It's not a stone, only glass. And I think if it's left out in the elements, like rain and mold, it breaks down pretty quickly. Maybe it's a special kind of obsidian?
Maybe.
Aiden agreed.
Otherwise, I'm not sure what's so special about a piece of black glass.
Maybe the gods consider it special.
Niwa said.
Niwa is right.
Clyde said, trying not to recall the terrifying face she'd seen in the obsidian.
Temples are for a god's special things.
A god looking for vengeance?
Aiden glanced around, almost expecting the room to look different. The mention of a god still made his back stiffen.
That statue outside must have been honoring a god.
Rikaru said, excited.
That was obsidian the statue held. Oh, and I bet those vines were crafted with obsidian somehow. It would explain why they were still shiny and durable after all this time. It's like an arcane focus.
If it were Arcana, then Gorram wouldn't have hated it so much. I guess if a god does it, it isn't arcane.
Aiden was irritated, thinking his father could have explained things he was finally learning for himself.
Is this obsidian?
Clyde had finally decided to mention the dagger she'd found on the dead woman's body. She held it forward so her hand wouldn't obstruct the hilt.
No, that's a dagger.
Aiden realized how dismissive that sounded.
I mean, yes. That's probably obsidian in it.
You said the wall talks about two gods?
Niwa wanted to allay her brother's rough response.
Another god sent angels to fight in a war. Is obsidian special to the other god too? I thought it was a fight to repair life. So, one god wants vengeance, and another wants new life?
Could be.
Aiden was studying a symbol that looked remarkably like the object that had passed over him that fateful day they'd had to leave their home.
This must have been the obsidian god's temple, judging by that statue. Do these gods have names?
Rikaru asked his brother.
No, the wall didn't say any names.
Aiden said.
Walls don't say anything.
Rikaru felt bad for sounding so pedantic. Aiden wasn't listening. He was studying an image of an angelic warrior. He ran his fingers along its intricate details. As he traced the outline of the sword, almost unconsciously, he said,
Leiru.
From the back of the temple, a woman groaned. The noise sounded baleful and malignant, echoing in the temple's open space. Then a wraith, an angry gnome, floated up.
The altar.
Rikaru had just understood what the counter was. The semi-transparent wraith rippled and shivered as she moved right through the altar. Her glassy eyes locked onto Aiden. Reaching out her hands and gliding toward him, she looked furious. Chapter 55. Fear.
Aiden!
Niwa called. She wanted to tell him to reach for his sword, to prepare for a fight, but words failed. Everything seemed to be happening quickly, yet playing out in slow motion. The wraith's mouth fell open. She bellowed a deep, otherworldly noise that reverberated through the temple. Clyde felt as if she were experiencing the gruesome scene she'd witnessed in the collapsed building. She clutched the obsidian dagger, ready to fight. But when the wraith let out that horrible noise, the tikus felt the strange power overwhelm her. She thought she could feel her brain rattling around, and she clutched her head, begging for the feeling to stop. Something had taken over her willpower. She had to flee the noise. Rikaru and Niwa experienced the same terrible fear overpowered them, and they found themselves running, along with Clyde, for the open window. They were abandoning their brother. Aiden heard and felt the wail, but didn't suffer the same fear as his siblings. He did grow nervous when he noticed them fleeing. He finally dismissed his create flame spell and held up his shield, braced to defend himself. When the wraith was within range, Aiden stepped forward, slashing his sword. Panic washed over him as his blade moved through the wraith. He reflexively held up his shield as the wraith's spectral hands extended towards him. Her fingers and then her palm passed right through his shield. Scrambling back, he lost his footing and fell to the earthen floor.
I can't hit this.
Aiden called in vain. One of his hands felt cold. Frost was forming across the portion of the shield the wraith had touched. He tossed the shield aside and desperately swung his sword wide. The spectral hand thrust forward again. Aiden wasn't sure if the wraith had pushed him or if he'd attempted to dodge by slamming himself back against the earth. This time, she caught him. Her icy touch wrapped around his beating heart. He felt paralyzed as he struggled to find his breath. Aiden felt his blood freezing, ceasing to circulate. He couldn't see anything and wondered if the wraith had invaded his body.
They left me here to die alone.
He heard himself say.
I fought for them, and they abandoned me.
Fragments of thoughts appeared and then faded from his mind. They were all bitter. He wanted to see his cowardly siblings escaping out the window. He wanted to yell, to scream at Niwa for refusing to explore this temple, and then leaving him to die. He wanted to tell Clyde to find the damned camp on her own, since traveling to it had only brought them trouble. He felt smug knowing that if he were to die now, his intellectual brother wouldn't be able to read the rest of the temple walls. Aiden had never imagined a darkness like this. He realized these spiteful thoughts were not his own. Vengeance was taking him over, even as his body withered and died. In his last thought, he saw the Firebird passing over his childhood home. The tiny ember of Aiden's create flame spell reappeared in his hand. It seemed to have summoned itself, and its fire grew larger as its redness faded to gray. Aiden felt the warmth in his hand as the rest of him lay lifeless. The heat reminded him of the campfire in his nightmare. After thinking of his siblings with venom and spite, he saw them again in his mind. They were dead and covered in blood, just as they'd been so many times before.
Not yet. Wake up.
The beautiful woman from his nightmare was saying. Despite the darkness, smoke and ash engulfed her. Her voice came from within the billowing plumes. The nightmare remained unchanged, but its previous ending had come and gone. Aiden cradled the gray fireball in his hand. Then, having no other ideas, he flicked his wrist as hard as he could, tossing the fireball in the air. It landed squarely on his chest. In an instant, his body erupted in gray fire. The searing light of flames replaced the blinding darkness. He felt himself burning. In pain, he screamed in agony. Chapter 56. Burning Vengeance. After fleeing the temple, the siblings became aware they no longer heard the deep moaning inside their heads. The daylight shining down on the hill felt like a supernatural disinfectant. The contrast felt shocking, and it empowered them to act freely again. As they'd retreated, each had thought they'd vaguely heard Aiden shouting something, but hadn't been able to discern his words. Everything had been happening so quickly, and now their brother was still inside and fighting alone. The fear they'd felt still repelled them from the window. Before they could even speak, they heard Aiden scream. A sudden flash of light from within the temple overpowered that fear. From the window, they saw their brother limp on the ground. His body was burning, pale gray flames licked over him. The ghostly figure thrashed alongside him, recoiling as she struggled to maintain her grip on his heart.
Rook,
Niwa yelled.
lift me up.
Rikaru crouched and picked up the gnome by her waist. His turquoise hand supported her body, and he hoped this strange symbiote wouldn't fail him or his family now. Niwa clutched her doha as she grabbed at the interior temple wall and pulled herself in. Her light spell illuminated the dark space once again. Clyde followed her sister's lead and nimbly leapt back through the open window. She watched in horror as Niwa ran straight for Aiden's burning body. Aiden tried to focus on the strange things happening directly around him. Waves of heat radiated off him, warping what he could see of the temple. His body, however, still felt lifeless, as if cold blood flowed through his veins. After the initial burst of light and searing pain, Aiden felt strangely at peace as his body burned. His actions had harmed the Wraith. His sister's copper walking stick was reaching past the heat for his body. He thought of Niwa and smiled, then noticed she was crouched beside him. She didn't abandon me after all, he thought, as his breathing returned to normal. The obsidian dagger flashed by. The Wraith reeled. A streak of bright sparks remained after the dagger had sailed through her head. The sparks slowly descended like blood leaving an exit wound. Perfect shot, as always, he thought. Clyde had impeccable timing. His body began to thaw. Then, his limbs felt lighter. A sensation like his healing ability moved across his mind. He felt capable of defeating the evil facing him if he could only get up and fight. Then, a torrent of water blasted away the Wraith. Rikaru was also coming to the rescue with high-pressure water that traveled clear across the temple. The spectral hand clutching Aiden's beating heart finally released its grip. The ice running through his veins was burned away as the gray flames consuming his body subsided.
I owe you one,
Aiden tried to say as he struggled to stand. When he couldn't hear himself, he realized Niwa had protected everyone from the Wraith's wail. In her quick attempt to meditate, the gnome created silence in an invisible bubble around them. His family had displayed such cunning. Now it was his turn. The Wraith had stumbled after the torrent hit her, but had recovered quickly and floated back into action. She fixed her vicious eyes on Aiden and once more lunged forward. Aiden was armed with only a mediocre sword he'd recovered from a town guard in Silk Rhode. Nevertheless, the sensation that had thawed his body and imbued him with vitality now also radiated through that sword. His weapon and even his senses felt sharper. The wraith's hands would not reach him again. Aiden anticipated her attack and sidestepped her grasp. He swung his sword and watched in surprise as the blade cleaved both her arms clear off. The wraith howled in anguish as searing light cut through her wavering figure. But undeterred, she continued her advance. Aiden swirled around, dodging the wraith as she lunged to bite him. Coming up behind her, Aiden raised his sword, slicing it down, cutting her in half as gray flames burned her incorporeal body away. The wraith was completely destroyed. Surprised, Aiden had watched her menacing eyes become hopelessly sad the instant before the finishing strike. Wisps of spectral dust dissipated in the stale air as the temple fell still once again. Chapter 57. Another Way Home.
May I come in?
Niwa asked, popping her head into the makeshift nursery. Mitra looked up and nodded.
I heard some awful noises. What happened?
Niwa wondered if she looked injured. After they'd defeated the wraith, Aiden had given her a big hug, which had caused a strange thawing sensation to travel through her body. The exposure was brief but painful. Aiden's healing had helped her recover from her contact with the wraith.
Oh,
She looked down at her arms and clothes, covered in dirt.
I helped Aiden dig something out of the ground. He and Rook are getting rid of it now, in fact.
After Clyde had shown her siblings the large chunk of obsidian behind the altar, Aiden had insisted they dig it up and remove it from the temple.
Sure.
Mitra decided not to ask how digging up a large object related to the dreadful moan she'd heard earlier. She placed one newborn down gently and cradled another.
They're beautiful.
Niwa said.
Their fur is just barely peeking out. It looks like fuzz.
She picked at some dirt, clinging to her doha, hoping Mitra would invite her to see them up close.
Did Clyde go with them?
Mitra suspected the smaller tikus had gone behind the building to check if the stillborn pups had been properly buried. Niwa, shaking her head, looked a little discouraged. The mother tikus patted the ground beside her to keep her company. Niwa beamed as she scurried over to sit next to Shelfie and watch the pups sleep. She hoped to be here when the first one's eyes opened. Shortly after the battle, Clyde had slipped away to check on her homemade grave. When she found that it had been covered over, she closed her eyes and thought about how she felt first seeing newborn tikus pups. Clyde then ventured over to the rubble that had been the campus's retaining wall. She climbed to the shallow crater's rim, looked out over the valley, and reflected on what they'd discussed inside the temple. She thought about what circumstances must have been like for most of the life here to die. What had happened such that gods had brought their war here? What had gods wanted with this world? And why did the gods leave? She felt she could relate to Mitra in ways the others wouldn't understand. They both knew what it felt like to be viewed as creatures who weren't really people. None of the elves, humans, or gnomes had been called a rat before. Others treated tikus like a commodity, like firewood or rice. Azaka had said that the tikus had been manipulated to reproduce frequently and often, and young tikus grew up quickly. Clyde wondered if this war had anything to do with the supply of tikus. She had experienced the skills of those with a vested interest in reclaiming their stolen tikus. Back home, Clyde had never seen another tikus. Had Gorram and Saba raised her and her siblings where few people lived to keep them isolated and safe? Down in the valley, something was moving beneath the trees. A person was walking alone, someone tall and carrying a large rucksack, and headed towards Aubrey's house. As if the traveler sensed her watching, they looked up at the hills. Clyde doubted the person could see the temple, which was obscured by trees and a crater, let alone her. Discerning details from this distance was difficult, but the traveler looked like the girl she'd met after the fight at the roadhouse, the girl who'd called herself Copperwolf. A hallucination was becoming a reality. This orc girl could be the colleague Aubrey had mentioned would come to check on her. This was just speculation, but the idea made her feel better. With their sister's help, Aiden and Vicario had removed the large chunk of obsidian from the cool earth of the temple floor. It wasn't particularly heavy, but it was bulky and featured several sharp edges. It was Aiden's idea to haul the obsidian out of the temple and toss it down the hill. Rickario didn't see the point, but he also couldn't think of a reason not to. So he agreed to lend a turquoise hand.
I want to go home,
Rickario said. They were approaching the retaining wall past the collapsed building.
We all want to go home, Rook.
Aiden said. He looked at his brother as though this was the most obvious fact of all.
Niwa might have been onto something back in the temple,
The elf said.
One of Gorham's spells is titled Plane Shift. Back in Silk Rhode, I couldn't have imagined why someone would want to shift a planar object. But now I'm wondering if it has to do with shifting people across planar areas.
You lost me.
Aiden readily confessed.
I said there was a plane of angels. Is that what you mean? I don't think the wall said where that plane was.
The wall didn't describe the plane's location, but I think there are multiple planes. They might be coterminous with our world, or maybe with all worlds. I mean, we got to this world somehow, didn't we?
Rickario knew how he sounded to Aiden.
This is why you're Professor's favorite,
Aiden said. They'd reached the wall, and he glanced at the large black mass they carried. Black smoke faintly emanated from it, the same black smoke from his nightmare. His brother made no indication he saw this, which only affirmed his belief that this stone was evil. Together, they crouched, then successfully heaved the obsidian. Both were silent, enjoying watching the big lump tumbling down the hill, banking off trees and getting filthy. A moment later, it had fallen out of sight, and the rustling and thumping noises had ceased. The possible power source for a terrible evil had been relocated from a secured temple to some bushes in the middle of nowhere.
What are you talking about?
Rickario could see his brother becoming upset.
He loved all of us equally. Unless you're talking about his favorite student of Arcana. That one I'll grant you.
Aiden cleared his throat.
If you think you can get us home with some spell, I want to hear more about it. But it's not home anymore if the house is destroyed and our parents are dead. It's not fun to talk about this, but we should probably be on the same page about what we think happened back there.
No, Aiden.
Rickario said, trembling.
I think they'd been preparing to leave for years at a moment's notice. This is a morbid topic. To your point, if Gorram and Saba are gone, then yes, home is probably only a state of mind. It's not like we were close with anyone in Ravenscross or elsewhere.
He avoided describing their parents as dead, regardless of his fears.
But the girls will want to go home anyway.
Aiden said.
Let's assume we can get back. If we remain here, we might be able to stay on at the camp helping the tikus. If we return home, we might be starting with nothing all over again. Oh, and other people trying to kill us there, too.
So should we take our chances on a new world instead?
Rickario said.
We'll find them, Aiden. Come on, let's head back and discuss this as a family.
So you don't think they're here after all? Then, of course, we need to go back. They probably need our help.
Niwa said. Aiden moved to let the statue block the early afternoon sun from his eyes. The siblings had agreed to talk outside so as not to disturb Mitra.
You see?
Aiden said to Rickario.
I told you they'd want to go home.
Aiden, it's home.
Niwa emphasized.
I'm sure if we'd known of a way to get there sooner, we would have gone back already.
I'm staying.
Clyde was staring toward the wall that overlooked the valley. She was irritated her brother had just assumed he knew what she wanted. She didn't bother to articulate that part to him.
We can't split up the family.
Aiden, raising his voice, realized how forceful he sounded, but he didn't care.
We already are split up.
Niwa met his volume.
I love you all very much.
Rickario hoped to steer the discussion away from bickering.
I think that's a really important thing to say right now. And I wouldn't have proposed a way to go home if I thought it would split us up. There's no guarantee this plane shift spell will work, and it's not like I've practiced this spell before. This wouldn't be the same spell Gorram used to bring us here. I don't know what spell that was, quite honestly.
The siblings went silent for a moment.
I meant to say I don't want us to split up.
Aiden said more calmly.
We couldn't have made it this far without each other. I feel my main responsibility is to help and protect my family who mean more to me than anything.
Niwa allowed herself a deep breath.
Aiden, I couldn't agree more. Gorram and Saba need your help and protection right now, and we all need to be a family again.
Rickario was startled when Aiden and Niwa looked to him. He had no intentions of being the deciding vote.
We don't know what to expect if we try this, but if it works, we can probably come back here if necessary. Maybe we can go back to learn what happened. If things are as bad as we suspect, then we can just come back here and help the tikus.
Clyde was struggling to process her emotions. When her brother mentioned the tikus again, she knew she had to speak up.
If they sent us here, then they know to find us here. I'm staying to help the tikus. They are not an afterthought for me.
Clyde's right.
Aiden agreed.
Professor Gorram and Miss Saba must know how to travel here too. And they can ask the dwarf living in their weird twin house where to find us. That makes more sense to me than traveling through some plane of angels.
The sun had moved, and he stepped into the shade again.
Actually, I had attempted plane shift via the plane of water.
Rikaryu said, feeling sheepish. He'd wanted to mention this earlier, but didn't know how to explain or understand his feelings or his intimate relationship with the Jinni.
What are you talking about? There's a plane of water?
Niwa looked fascinated.
Part of me knows the area well.
The mage held out his turquoise arm. The water inside refracted light as it circulated like tiny ripples moved by the breeze.
We can't get home by going through water. We'll all drown.
Aiden looked bewildered.
Could you use that bubble spell again, Rook?
Niwa suggested.
I don't know.
Her brother admitted. He sighed.
What if we need to travel for hours or days to get across? I can't sustain a spell's effect for that long, especially if you all need to stay close within the bubble.
Were you planning on traveling there alone?
Aiden continued to feel this plan was an exercise in futility. It would only lead to hurt feelings and arguing.
I don't think I'd have to travel alone.
Rikaryu felt self-conscious as he thought of Oxbow trying to reach him again.
But let's not worry about any of this right now. I still haven't read this spell, and we still need to bring Mitra and the pups to the tikus camp first. Why don't we sit down to a meal together?
Clyde felt too upset to respond or even make eye contact. Suddenly, she had an idea.
Niwa, summon Gorram.
What?
Niwa had never considered this before, and the ramifications of trying to do it started racing through her mind.
If you're able to summon him, then he's dead, and you'll have your answers.
Clyde explained. To hear her sister suggest their father's death so cavalierly made Niwa want to cry. She knew, however, Clyde's idea had merit. She took another deep breath and found her resolve.
You're right. I'll do it.
On the next episode, Niwa prepares for the most important summoning of her life.
They have to feel special. They have to feel important when someone calls on them.
But if her spell works, does that mean Gorram and Saba are no longer alive? Desperate to know the truth, Niwa finds her resolve.
I think I'm ready now.
Is the summoning successful? Clyde doesn't wait to ask the hard question.
If Niwa can summon you, does this mean you're dead?
Will the siblings find the answers they need?
I just don't think we have a home to go back to anymore.
Chapter 58, Mother and Child Reunion. Next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 11 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Clyde, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Bill Robinson as Aiden, Sarah Luz as Mitra, and Holly Braga as Phoenix. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Swells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.